We speak. Our words. We listen.
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 Why did you decide to make this recording with us, Virginia?
Oh, I've longed for the behaviour analytic community to listen to what the neurodiversity advocates have been saying about ABA for many years, and also endeavoured to, despite my criticisms of some applications of behaviourism, also hoped that maybe some of the autistic critics who, heaven knows, have legitimate reasons to criticise the harms, nonetheless to start talking about where there may be common ground, where there may be shared purpose about when, if some sort of external intervention may be helpful to promote quality of life. I think the debate has become so polarised. Autistic Radio has done an amazing thing in enabling a really respectful conversation to happen.
If you start flattering us like that, I'm going to put that straight in the recording.
Listening to the podcasts has given me hope. A conversation that leads to some shared values. What has upset me in the past, a real sort of polarization, which has got worse and worse. I used to think there's never going to be any ability to talk across the Great Divide. I've been so encouraged. And I do believe that it's really important because, as Michelle Dawson said, behaviorism can be a very powerful tool. We've really got to figure out what's a good and right intervention as opposed to a harmful and very damaging one.
Well, it feels as though we need to do is repeat everything you've just said, loud and clear, keep repeating it. Everything there is in a nutshell, isn't it? Why don't you tell me a little bit about how you personally relate to autism?
My journey, as it were, as a parent of an absolutely gorgeous, now 30-year-old autistic man, how I personally relate to autism is very different from how I did when my son was diagnosed back in 1996. It's a journey we've all been on. I see autism as a part of human diversity. I see autistic people as diverse as neurotypical people are, but with great capacity for many strengths. I no longer see it as a mere list of deficits, even though the diagnostic criteria primarily do. I know and love autistic people. I know and love neurotypical people. Sometimes the differences seem very noticeable and other times they seem to vanish. And I think it's partly depends on how well you know someone as to whether you notice those differences or they just become part of who that person is.
That's a very personal thing that you've said there. Your relationship to autism is personal and through your son, and it's been going on for a long time.
Mm.
You talked about a gulf, maybe a gulf between people who are autistic or experience themselves as the neurodivergent part of neurodiversity. Did I get that right? But then the other aspect is the behaviorism aspect. So how did it come to be that you are in both parts? You've got one leg in both parts.
Key question. When my son was 3 and diagnosed, It was at a time, early, mid-90s, when the media was awash with miracle cures, therapy A to Z, be it diet, be it vitamins, be it craniosacral therapy. People kept sending me articles about these so-called amazing interventions. The framework in which autism was viewed in those days was entirely negative. As a parent, you felt if you didn't try out interventions, you were letting your child down in some way.
So there's a social pressure.
Absolutely. Huge social pressure. And that comes partly from the medical model. When you're given a diagnosis, it's couched as bad news. But it's also the wider society that finds it easier to respond to people who behave in conformist ways that don't seem too noticeably different. So I found out about ABA as part of that quest for intervention. I was very reluctant. I myself was very suspicious about behaviorism, the bits I'd heard about it. Then I went to see a child being taught at home using what was probably fairly approximate for the Lovas model, and I have very little good to say about that. But the child was happy.
Yeah.
That particular child was smiling and whooping with pleasure when he was successful. And he had learnt lots of things. And I thought, oh, well, if this is ABA, maybe I should give it a go.
Okay. Open-minded.
I think I'd run out of reasons not to try.
And it's your son, and you're trying to reach out.
Yeah, I wanted to help him. This is an important thing that parents go through, even if you love your child totally and unconditionally, as I did and do. I felt that because of not only being autistic, but having a profound learning disability, intellectual disability, life was going to be harder for him than for more typically developing children. Parents don't want life to be hard for their children.
No, we want to do the best.
So I wanted to do what I could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear you.
So we started on an ABA program and he enjoyed it. Now that I know all the criticisms and the harms, I think there are two key reasons why he enjoyed it, but why a lot of other people would find it really awful. He is socially motivated. He likes being with people. He enjoys relationships and he liked being with his tutors and they made it fun. So, and I heard on a previous podcast a really important point I think you made, Jules, about this traditional stereotypical view of ABA, that it's this sort of adult almost permanently in the face of the autistic person, and that can be really relentless and intrusive. And I can see why that could be awful. But I just have to say, for my son, he really liked his tutors and he liked being with them. Their use of positive reinforcement in the language was mainly sensory. He absolutely adored being rough and tumble and being swung around. And so he was hugely motivated to be with them. And of course, later on, I'd hear about all the sensory aspects of autism, which in those days didn't feature at all in what people were telling us about autism. But thanks to the testimony of autistic people, have become centre stage. So I look back and think that's why my son enjoyed it. But key amongst this is you cannot generalise. All I saw was good stuff, as I feel. So I was blind at that stage to the negative experiences that I would subsequently hear about. read about and be forced to think again about when and if and how behaviour analysis should be practiced.
Virginia, I want you to be okay. And I can hear there's an emotion here.
Think about the journey of seeing the positive scenarios first is how natural it is in any sort of method. There will be a number of times and cases when the folks match what they're looking for and their aims match. You say that the child wanted, in this case, similar things to folks working with him wished him to want, so it means that the negative situations didn't arise and weren't seen. It's kind of similar to folks getting on well with school when they get a lucky setting with it and not seeing or kind of taking in at that stage the validity of what it can be like when it goes very wrong for people. And I've I think been there because having something that started looking right and went very wrong later, everyone's learning journey can quite fairly be like that, understandably.
I'm obviously emotionally affected by your words, Virginia. I think it's that reaching out, that emotional reaching out of empathy. I can imagine your son. I can imagine him playing with the professionals that have come, that are in his house, that are friendly and have activities. When it no longer feels appropriate for you, probably as he gets older or the person changes, I'm a bit concerned that I'm going to get hurt by hearing what happens next.
Yeah, I think Maurice hit the nail on the head, that when you get the right conditions, things can go incredibly well, and journeys can start well. A child can go to a school that they're really happy in, and it can suit them, and the environment is right. And then there may be other developments later on that suddenly the sensitivities and the vulnerabilities to the wider environment, or not being understood, not understanding what's expected, and all those social pressures can suddenly make what was a good place to be, it can become very punishing, actually traumatizing. For my son, that didn't happen. Because I was so keen on it at the time, I helped set up a school that was determined to be an ABA school, because it was felt that ABA was more hopeful, not by taking away someone's autism. Never felt that. But because, unlike a lot of teachers at the time, the behavioural teachers actually seemed to believe in the potential of their children to learn, whereas others were writing off their pupils, oh, well, the autistic kids never learn anything, kind of thing. At the time, ABA seemed to be the approach that offered hope. And I don't mean hope in all the horrible things like making someone indistinguishable from their peers. The parents I knew and the circles I moved in, we weren't wanting our children to be indistinguishable from their peers. And in fact, what parent does really? We all want our children to be unique. But it was much later when I began to think there is some dissonance here. For example, what is deemed challenging behaviour? I just felt things like stimming weren't challenging. And the argument would be, well, it's preventing somebody from learning, it's distracting them from their learning. And I thought, really? Maybe they need to. And then I would gradually, I started to need to research quite heavily, and eventually did a PhD in ethics. And it was all around the ethics of cure, treatment, and intervention. Because increasingly, even if my son was enjoying school and there were a lot of other pupils who were enjoying school, there actually started to be discussions within that environment about what's a legitimate goal and what is merely a conformist goal. And I think ABA schools that might have started quite rigidly, hopefully those ethical debates are continuing to this day. I'm not involved in that anymore. My son then developed really awful health problems. So the idea of him being able to have any energy left to sort of learn all the other things taught in a school, that was severely compromised by just getting through the day. And what I learned then was that the things we needed to teach him were how to tolerate a hospital environment or how to be able to take medication. And for me, those learning goals became far more important than anything else. And I think even then, I was lucky enough to have support from a couple of people who had been behavioural practitioners, but were now not using it strictly, but just aware of behavioural principles. It was a matter of life and death that he learnt to take his medicine. The ideas around positive reinforcement seemed really relevant still. We wanted to help him be motivated. And none of that felt pernicious or normalizing or stigmatizing. It just felt in his best interests. And I think discussions around best interests and values and ethics are what the conversation about behavior analysis and about neurodiversity, they have to center around values and best interests. And I think if we can get that right, maybe some of the other real culture wars, as some people call it, might begin to go away.
Thank you, Virginia. It's really touching. The intelligence and the compromise that you have used in dealing with your own personal situation. As a parent, I can hear it. I feel as I have good news for you. Because this gulf that you're describing is not something that I perceive. I have a lineup of various different professionals coming here to speak on Autistic Radio. My experience through Autistic Radio and starting ABA, the Big Autism-Conversation, as a series of conversations with behaviourist professionals, has given me a great deal of hope. The people who have come and spoken to us, they're looking at ABA from the idea of human rights. They're looking at ABA from the idea of low arousal responses. It looks to me as though at least the people at the top, at least the people in real research, not the ABA research we see on social media, which is effectively sales, they're bringing what you're saying to the profession. So I think there's hope there, and I think there's change going on. The impression we get of the gulf is about social media, and that's a very small number of people. I think the majority of autistic people come from a standpoint that is much more open than the protests that have possibly been necessary in the past.
That's really encouraging. I do think social media, as we see in so many areas, it has great power for good, but boy, can it really polarize people and create horrible hostilities. I keep my head under the parapet with social media. I've heard from others just how nasty it can be. But as you say, the conversations that you've instigated And behind the scenes also sort of private conversations I've had with behaviour analysts who are really trying to think about this. Also what I'd call the ABA parent movement. There is room for encouragement. There is always going to be disagreements, but I think it's the tendency to generalise and to make sweeping statements without the nuances and caveats of individual situations that we're missing out on a lot of the time, and which maybe polarises the debate. Behind the scenes are parents who've opted for ABA, possibly because nothing else seemed available, possibly because their own children did seem to be enjoying it. They themselves could be quite caustic about some of the professionals who they felt were a bit up themselves with their own science, or a bit rigid about what they deemed to be challenging behaviour. You know, we parents are a mixed bunch, just like the professionals are, and just like our children are. Parents have come to ABA for different reasons. You know, there are some who still long for a recovery. There are still some who think, on balance, if there was a cure, they'd go for it. There are many others who, especially as time wears on and they get to know their child better and better and better, and realise that their child needs to be the person they are and can't be transformed into someone who, in theory, could have an easier life if they were neurotypical. Parents adapt, just as professionals adapt, and values can change and do over time. And I do wonder if those who are most vociferous about behaviorism are basing it on 1990s behaviorism or 1960s behaviorism. One of the elephants in the room, and I know Andy has talked about elephants in the room before, it's the difference between the UK and the United States. I don't know too much about any of the individual companies that operate the economic model of insurance-based funding for interventions.
Yep, there we go. That's the one. People are going to be shouting at the radio now.
Have I put my foot in it?
No, you've said the magic thing. Follow the money.
Follow the money.
If you want to take a good thing, something that is based on science, based on an absolute attempt to support a group of people and get it out there, if you go the way of selling it as a service, it doesn't take very long before that imperative to selling it as a service destroys the thing you're trying to sell. It's just the way it works. But we don't have to do that here in the UK. We don't have to follow that model.
Yeah. You're right. If it's insurance-based, obviously insurance companies want to reduce the costs long term. They love the thought of recovery. They like the thought of not having to pay long-term support costs. And they will base it on actuarial calculations based on randomized control trials, which of course has nothing to do with intervening on an individual's own presentation and their own needs and their own best interests. UK, well, the public sector pool of money to invest in social care and educational care is limited. So people still maybe want to see results that reduce costs long term rather than just look in terms of human welfare. The thing I always say is a happy person with agency being able to have their needs met in a way that isn't oppressive and who is supported to live their best life is less likely to need horrendous levels of 4-to-1 restraint, and more likely, even someone like my son with all his difficulties, more likely to be able to have a good life with 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, that it will come good economically if you actually meet individual needs according to what's right for them.
What you certainly can have, UK, is the culture of child mental health and case conferences and professionals discussing the best interests between them, and then seeing themselves as the advisors of what is best. So those are always pressures on parents. And do the parents you've spoken to, are they getting on well at holding off that or standing up to it if it happens, and not getting pulled out of the reasonability zone that they started out with, and being able to lead the professionals with them in the seeing what's the child's taking badly?
There's still a massive gap in provision generally. I think a lot of families, especially with autistic and neurodivergent children who have very significant mental health problems, many of which have been socially induced, I'm sure. I think they don't feel they're getting the support. The child and adolescent mental health services often almost wash their hands of young people on the autism spectrum. I think we have such a long way to go as a society. There's so much avoidable suffering. One of the reasons I've always been keen for the reform of behavioural analysis, so that it isn't having to defend itself against legitimate criticism, but instead leaning into responding to the criticisms and changing. I still believe that behaviour analysis has the potential to do an awful lot of good when delivered ethically, responsibly, person-centeredly, and listening to what their clients, patients, and the people who know them best are really wanting and needing. The whole professional infrastructure needs to be reformed, not just behaviour analysis, but everywhere. But there is hope, not just despair.
It's quite apparent in the experience of your autism service use what a mixture there is of standards, caring practice or careless practice, listening, leading ideas practice or out-of-date practice. And the mixture of reforming things to engage with and encourage, and the other ingrained situations to protest about, is likely to be there both at once for a long time. I certainly think it is in the wider autistic picture.
Yeah. Yes, that is actually an important thing there, that word protest, because frankly there is going to be need for protest and whistleblowers and people who frankly say no. In my place, in my placement, in my hospital, in my environment, in my school, the situation is abusive and it needs calling out. If I say a reasonable conversation and an open conversation and a positive movement towards change, I also have to have in the back of my head something that says I cannot deny many people of the autistic population's need to make their voice heard enough. Had those voices not been made before, many changes that have happened within ABA might not have happened in the same way.
100%. Yes. More protest needs to happen, I believe, where things are still going awry. There has been an arrogance in the higher echelons of the behaviour analytic community. Some of those who tend to wave their doctorates and professorships around a bit too much and maybe don't engage enough with what autistic people are saying. There have been people like that I've met.
It's quite possible that I'll be speaking to them later on.
All I'll say, and don't worry, I won't mention any names, those who were terribly wedded to everything has to be observable and measurable, and everything has to be on graphs and p-values and statistics and things, really were dismissive within research of the role of qualitative research, and even more dismissive of sort of first-person experiences. But of course, research needs to be all those things according to what it is you're trying to find out. And I think that the best practitioners value first-person accounts and qualitative work every bit as much as doing the sort of before and after case study, quite rigorous science. I think some behaviour analysts have got off on being scientists and forgotten that actually all science is based on values. It's based on, well, what are the interesting questions to ask? You can't just avoid values and ethics and just be so obsessed by the measurable that nothing else seems to matter. But the world is changing, and the autistic voices of protest have been absolutely crucial in that. Absolutely. Bring it on.
Use the phrase elephant in the room. I'm just going to grab a trunk and see if I can get him into the room and stare at him. What big ears you have. We can't afford it. We're not going to afford it. It's never going to happen. What people want as personal provision for their child is not going to happen through taxation in the state. Just not going to happen. Some people with sharp elbows will get an unusually large amount of attention. There is no way away from that.
I think the data will one day demonstrate that investment in high quality support might save public money long term.
Of course it would. But we, as a society, have so many other things that we could invest in long term to save money. And we need to face the fact that the huge increase in people who have realised that they are not part of the majority neurotypical community, and that the children coming through schools now with the massive increase in realisation and diagnosis is overwhelming the system, and would have overwhelmed a system even before we started cutting everything back to the bone.
Mm.
Now that puts behaviourists at a very strange crossroads. The people I'm speaking to speak to what you say, the progression of the profession, the change, the understanding of the neurodiversity paradigm. They speak about human rights and being informed by that. But if their colleagues going out there to create practice, they can't find practice paid for by the state, they're going to go directly to the parents.
Mm.
Which means you're going to have this two-type ABA if we're not careful. We're going to have what everyone thinks is the gold standard, the neurodiversity-informed new version. In fact, going back to real behaviourist principles before they got taken into something else. And then there's a market, and the market grows. You talked about it being paid for through insurance plans. As soon as it becomes predominantly that kind of private service, I'm afraid you'll see a rowing back on all of those other principles, more of the bean counting on what you can prove to the parents has been a change, and we will move towards an American model. That's why I want to have this conversation. I want to stop us going down that road. I'm not here to tell behaviourists they've all got everything wrong. I'm here because I'm worried about what might happen to their profession.
I think you've said that really clearly, and I would agree it's a real worry. And I think it also reflects, in a way, what's still happening, because you're either privately able to fund an expensive intervention, or you may have to, as a family, employ legal people so that you can win at tribunal. Or, and this happens, I'm sure, and it may have happened in my family, the local gatekeepers think, oh, well, this is a well-resourced family. They've got qualifications behind them, etc. We're never going to win against them, so let's give in and agree a generous package for this family, because we know that a lot of other families won't have the knowledge or the stamina. Or
Virginia, I feel as though we've only just started this conversation. I feel as though what you've said so far is so important that we need to revisit it with you, and I want you to come back and speak with us. I also want you to come back and plug your book, because we haven't even got onto it yet. So, can we make another conversation, another recording with you, Virginia?
of course you can. I'm just really grateful to have this opportunity. I think what you've started to do with these conversations is absolutely superb, and I feel honoured to be part of it. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. I'll try and make that into an advert. Well, here we go. Thank you for listening to us today. If you're listening out there and you feel that you have something to add to this conversation, we hope that you will find it a comfortable experience and follow Virginia, follow the people that we've had. Join us here on Spectrum Voices. Join the ABA-PBS-Behaviorism, the big autism conversation here on Autistic Radio. Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you very much.
We'll be speaking again with you soon.
Lovely.
Autistic Radio is personal and it's informal, which means that those taking part speak only for themselves. If they mention an organisation that they work for or they're a member of, they're not speaking on behalf of that organisation. We shouldn't take any implication from that. It's also the case that people's opinions change over time. So while this recording is there forever, people change.